Okay, so let's unpack this. Imagine it's 1992, right? You're deep inside the Pentagon, and a group of strategists is drafting what is essentially a blueprint for, well, total unquestioned global domination.
Right, which sounds like hyperbole, but it really isn't.
No, it's not. And this thing was so aggressive, so controversial, that when it eventually leaked to the press, because of course it did, the White House completely threw it under the bus. I mean, they publicly disowned the entire document.
Just completely washed their hands of it.
Exactly. And then, get this, 16 years later, the Defense Department was still trying to use like a black marker to censor the text from the public record.
Even though everyone had already read it.
Yeah. But the wildest part is that if you look out your window today, you, the listener, are living inside the exact geopolitical architecture that this censored document built, down to the very last bolt.
What's fascinating here is that it's the strategic equivalent of finding the original pencil sketch for a machine that just ended up running the entire planet. Because, you know, we often treat history as this chaotic, spontaneous series of reactions. A crisis happens, governments react.
Right, like it's all just improvised.
Exactly. But occasionally, if you dig deep enough into the archives, you actually find the script. You find the underlying source code that programmed the reactions of a superpower for decades to come.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to trace the unbelievable lifespan of a single, highly classified piece of paper. It's called the 1992 Draft Defense Planning Guidance, or the DPG.
And it really is quite a journey.
Oh, it's wild.
Yeah.
We're following this document from its secretive creation, right in the ashes of the Cold War, through its scandalous leak, its weird sort of exile in the political wilderness of the 1990s, and its ultimate resurrection as the defining military strategy of the 21st century.
And to do this, we are relying on a really deeply researched profile compiled by a group called the Militarist Monitor.
Yeah, and we need to pause here because it's so important to establish the context of that source right up front.
Definitely. The Militarist Monitor is a political monitoring group, and they have a very specific critical lens on military policy. They're analyzing policies that span multiple administrations, you know, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, all the way through to Donald Trump.
Right, which means we are dealing with highly charged, deeply polarizing political history. So for you listening right now, let's just set the ground rules for this conversation. We are not here to take the side of the Militarist Monitor, okay? And we aren't here to endorse or condemn the politicians, the drafters, or any of the specific administrations involved.
Right, that's not what this deep dive is about.
Exactly. Our job is just to hold this source material up to the light, impartially report on what's in it, and help you understand the raw mechanics of how these abstract ideas become global reality.
Because, honestly, regardless of your personal politics, this document just offers a masterclass in the mechanics of power. It really forces us to look past the daily news cycle and examine the foundational logic, the actual math, so to speak, that a global superpower uses to wield its influence at a really critical juncture in human history.
Well, let's talk about that juncture.
Yeah.
Because to understand why this blueprint was even written in the first place, you have to grasp the sheer, terrifying vacuum it was trying to fill.
The post-Cold War void.
Yeah, exactly. So the years are 1991 and 1992. The Berlin Wall is gone. The Soviet Union has just collapsed entirely. I mean, the Cold War is over. And for 40 years, the entire planet operated under this existential standoff.
The defining conflict of the era.
Yeah, and you'd think that for the Pentagon, winning the Cold War would feel like the ultimate victory lap, right?
Yeah.
Time to celebrate. But reading the source material, it sounds a lot more like an organizational panic attack. Am I misreading that?
Not at all. It was an institutional identity crisis on a scale that is almost impossible to overstate. I mean, think about the physical and economic reality of the U.S. defense establishment in 1991.
It's massive.
Right. You have entire government agencies, millions of careers, sprawling academic departments, and literally trillions of dollars in defense infrastructure that were exclusively engineered for one singular purpose.
Containing the Soviet threat.
Exactly, containing the Soviet threat.
So it's kind of like, it's like a massive, ruthless corporation that has just spent 40 years locked in a cutthroat price war. You've built your entire business model around destroying this one specific rival.
And you won.
You won. You wake up on a Tuesday and your rival has just dissolved. They closed their doors. But you don't just take a vacation. You look at your millions of employees, your factories, your astronomical budget, and you suddenly ask, what exactly is our purpose today?
That is the precise dilemma. The machinery of state doesn't just power down because the enemy surrendered. The George H.W. Bush administration is looking at this massive apparatus, and they realize they need a completely new rationale for its existence.
So they have to invent a new mission.
Right. So Defense Secretary Dick Cheney initiates a project. He tasks two key officials, Lewis Libby and Paul Wolfowitz, with drafting the new defense planning guidance.
Okay, a defense planning guidance. On its face, that sounds like a spreadsheet. It sounds like standard, boring, bureaucratic paperwork where you decide, like, how many planes to buy next year. Why is this specific DPG so revolutionary?
Well, mostly because of the blank slate it was written on.
Yep.
Normally, a DPG outlines military strategy and provides a framework for the budget, and you just adjust it slightly year over year.
Just moving numbers around.
Exactly. But this is the very first DPG of the post-Cold War era. Libby and Wolfowitz aren't just tweaking a budget, they are being asked to invent an entirely new framework for American defense policy from scratch. They're basically writing the first chapter of a new era.
And they don't do it alone either. The actual pen-to-paper drafting is handed to an official named Zalmay Khalilzad. But the source points out they brought in all these outside experts.
Yeah, heavy hitters.
Right. They consulted with figures like Richard Pearl, Albert Wohlstetter, and Andrew Marshall, who was the head of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. But, I mean, why bring in outside consultants for a highly classified internal defense document?
Because it really speaks to the philosophical magnitude of the task. They weren't just asking generals how to deploy troops, They were asking grand strategists how to structure the world.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, like Andrew Marshall, for instance. He spent decades running the Office of Net Assessment, looking at long-term, over-the-horizon threats. When you bring in minds like that, you aren't looking for a tactical manual. You're looking for a unified field theory for American power.
A unified field theory. That's a great way to put it.
And crucially, you have to look at the ideological alignment of the people in that room.
Yeah, the source creates a very clear distinction here. It notes that the George H.W. Bush administration at large was dominated by foreign policy realists. But the people drafting this document, Libby, Wolfowitz, Pearl, Khalilzad, they were neoconservatives.
A very different camp.
Very different. And I want to spend some time here because this tension seems to drive the entire conflict of our story today. Break down the mechanical difference between a realist and a neoconservative in 1992.
It really comes down to how they view the ultimate goal of statecraft. A realist looks at the international system as a permanent anarchy where states compete for power. For a realist, the goal is stability.
Just keeping things calm.
Right. It's about maintaining a balance of power. If the Soviet Union falls, a realist says, okay, the balance has shifted. Let's manage our regional relationships, avoid overextending ourselves, and just keep the peace through pragmatic diplomacy.
So a realist just wants to keep the boat from tipping over.
Exactly.
What does the neoconservative want?
The neoconservative wants to rebuild the boat entirely, and they want to be the only ones steering it. The drafters of this document looked at the fall of the Soviet Union not just as a victory, but as this unprecedented, historically fleeting opportunity.
Like a window that's going to close.
Right. They didn't want a balance of power anymore. They believed that the United States could, and morally should, reshape the entire international order so decisively that no rival could ever challenge them again.
Which brings us to the actual blueprint. We are opening the document now, and the overarching objective stated in the 1992 draft DPG is incredibly blunt. I'm going to quote directly from the Militarist Monitor's profile here. It says, "Our first objective is to prevent the reemergence of a new rival."
It's just right there in black and white.
Yeah. I mean, that doesn't sound like managing threats. That sounds like stopping the clock on global history.
And that single sentence is the gravitational center of the entire strategy. Notice the language there. It does not say defeat a current enemy. It explicitly says prevent the reemergence of a new rival. Right. This is a strategy of absolute permanent unipolarity. It demands a global system where there is only one pole of power, and that's Washington.
But how do you mechanically achieve that? You can't just declare you're in charge and expect everyone to go along with it.
Well, the draft gets very specific about that. It states that the strategy requires the U.S. to prevent any hostile power from dominating a region whose resources would, under consolidated control, be sufficient to generate global power.
And then it names the regions. It explicitly lists Western Europe, East Asia, the territory of the former Soviet Union, and Southwest Asia. And I have a massive problem with this list.
Let's hear it.
Western Europe and East Asia.
Oh.
We're talking about Germany, France, the UK, Japan, South Korea. These are our closest allies.
They are.
Why on earth would a classified American defense document explicitly target regions filled with our friends as areas where we must prevent another power from rising? Are we, viewing our allies as potential enemies here?
This is honestly the most counterintuitive and arguably the most brilliant piece of logic in the entire document. It wasn't about treating allies as enemies. It was about understanding the mechanics of how arms races start.
Okay, walk me through that.
Think about the historical context. If you are a strategist in 1992, you have just survived a 20th century that saw two catastrophic world wars. Both of those wars were ignited by great power competition in Europe and East Asia.
Right, you had armed Germany, Imperial Japan.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to 1992, the Soviet Union is gone. The massive threat that kept Western Europe and East Asia huddled under the American security umbrella has just evaporated overnight.
They don't need us the same way anymore.
Right. And the neoconservative drafters realized something terrifying. If Germany or Japan suddenly felt insecure in this new world, if they felt they had to provide their own defense, they would naturally begin to rearm. They have massive industrial economies.
So they have the money and the factories to build huge military.
Yep. And if they rearm, their neighbors panic, and suddenly a new arms race begins.
Ah, I see. So it's the security umbrella mechanism. It's like if I tell my neighbor, don't bother buying a security system and definitely don't buy a gun because I am going to patrol the entire neighborhood with a tank.
That's a perfect analogy.
My neighbor gets to save a lot of money and just focus on his garden. But the hidden catch is that my neighbor is now completely dependent on me for his basic survival.
That is precisely the mechanism. The DPG explicitly outlines 3 supporting aspects to make this work. First, the U.S. must show the leadership necessary to establish a new order, essentially convincing any potential competitors that they simply don't need to aspire to a greater role because America has it handled.
Right. We'll do the fighting, you do the manufacturing.
Exactly that. Second, the document says the U.S. must account for the interests of advanced industrial nations to discourage them from challenging our leadership or seeking to overturn the established political and economic order.
But how does that actually work in practice? Account for their interests?
No.
Are we just giving them favorable trade deals?
Oh, it goes much deeper than trade deals. It's about systemic dependence. The U.S. Navy patrols the global shipping lanes. We secure the Strait of Malacca. We secure the Persian Gulf. We guarantee that the oil flows to Japan and the goods flow out of Germany.
We're basically the global security guard.
Right. By providing that global public good, the security of the global commons, we effectively subsidize the economies of advanced industrial nations. But in exchange, we hold the keys to their prosperity. If they challenge U.S. unipolarity, they risk the very system that makes them rich.
Wow. Okay, and what was the third mechanism?
The third is the hammer. The draft states the U.S. must maintain the mechanisms for deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role. It's psychological dominance.
And the tenets laid out in the text to achieve this are just staggering. I mean, they list massive defense spending, asserting lone superpower status, the willingness to use preventative or preemptive force, forsaking multilateralism, so basically ignoring the UN or international coalitions if they don't suit U.S. interests.
Completely unilateral action if necessary.
Yeah. And a commitment to selective intervention. The draft literally argues the U.S. should retain the responsibility for righting wrongs around the globe, even in disputes that aren't directly related to our own security.
They basically wrote a job description for the United States as the sole architect, judge, jury, and enforcer of the global order. It is a fundamental philosophical shift from defending the homeland to managing the entire planet.
But grand strategy in a windowless room is one thing. Reality is another. So in March of 1992, this top-secret thought experiment just crashes into public view. The draft DPG is leaked.
A massive leak.
Yeah, the New York Times and the Washington Post get their hands on it, and it hits the front pages.
And you really have to put yourself in the political climate of early 1992 to understand the explosion this caused.
Because the public wasn't expecting this.
Not at all. The public is expecting a peace dividend. The Cold War is over, and the taxpayers want to know when defense spending is going to drop so we can invest in domestic infrastructure. Instead, they open the newspaper and read that the Pentagon is planning to police the entire globe forever.
The uproar is immediate, and it is massive. And it's not just the opposition party either. The source notes that Democrats were furious, obviously, but even figures within the Bush administration were totally stunned.
It was too much too fast.
Yeah. Senator Joseph Biden, who was chairing the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time, publicly attacks the leaked draft. He famously denounces it as a prescription for, literally, a Pax Americana. Let's unpack that phrase for a second. Why was Pax Americana considered such an insult in 1992?
Well, Pax Americana translates to American peace, and it draws a direct historical parallel to the Pax Romana of the Roman Empire. When Biden uses that phrase, he is accusing the Pentagon of reckless empire building.
He's calling them imperialists, basically.
Exactly. He is arguing that a democratic republic has no business acting like imperial Rome. The concept of unilaterally enforcing peace across the globe sounded dangerous, arrogant, and overwhelmingly expensive to a political establishment that was, largely composed of realists.
The blowback is so intense that the White House steps in and publicly retracts the document. They just disown it entirely. But this introduces my favorite dynamic in Washington politics, the gap between public outrage and private validation.
Oh, this happens all the time.
Right. Because while the White House is feeding this document to the wolves, the actual architect of the project, Dick Cheney, is thrilled. The source notes that Khalilzad, the guy who actually typed the draft, claimed Cheney was deeply impressed. Cheney allegedly told him, "You've discovered a new rationale for our role in the world."
Cheney asked for a rationale to keep the military machine running, and they gave him an airtight one. And it wasn't just Cheney either. Outside the government, prominent neoconservative thinkers rushed to defend the logic of the leak.
They weren't backing down.
No, the source points to a column by Charles Krauthammer. He asked the critics a very pointed question. He said, "What is the alternative? The alternative is Japanese carriers patrolling the Strait of Malacca and a nuclear Germany dominating Europe."
I want to stop and analyze Krauthammer's defense for a minute because it exposes the terrifying math underneath the policy. He is basically saying, you might hate the arrogance of American empire, but you will hate the alternative a lot more. But if that logic is so sound to them, why did the Bush White House publicly retract the document? Why not just stand behind it?
Because of the polite fictions of diplomacy. The White House had to retract it because you cannot stand at a podium in front of the International Press Corps and declare, "Our official state policy is to ensure that our closest allies remain permanently subservient to our military." That shatters your alliances overnight.
Right. You can't say the quiet part out loud. You can't tell Germany, "Hey, we are doing this to keep you down."
Exactly. But internally, Krauthammer's fear of a multipolar world was visceral, and it was widely shared among the drafters. A multipolar world where several great powers balance against each other is historically incredibly bloody.
Just look at the early 20th century.
Right. The neoconservative argument was that American unipolarity wasn't an act of aggression, it was a global public service. It was the only thing preventing a slide back into the slaughterhouse of the 1930s.
So publicly, the blueprint is dead. The source explains that I. Louis Libby is tasked with writing a revised, finalized version of the DPG to clean up the mess. But how do you rewrite a document that has been fundamentally rejected by your own boss?
Well, according to a book cited by the Militarist Monitor, James Mann's Rise of the Vulcans, Libby didn't actually change the strategy.
He just changed the tone.
Exactly. He softened the hard edges, added some diplomatic padding, but perfectly preserved the core concepts, shaping the security environment, acting alone when needed, and maintaining a dominant edge.
He sanded off the abrasive language. But the structural integrity of the unipolar vision remained completely intact. However, time had basically run out for the realists and the neoconservatives alike. The George H.W. Bush administration loses the 1992 election. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, takes the White House.
And that's that.
Yeah, the 1992 draft DPG is tossed into the political wilderness, effectively buried by the incoming administration. And logic dictates that this is where the story should end. Right? A controversial draft, disowned by its own president, buried by the rival party, it should just be a historical footnote.
But ideas, especially ones that offer total power, don't just evaporate.
No, they don't. So where did this strategy live for the next 8 years?
This is where we have to examine the mechanics of the Washington think tank. When a political faction loses the White House, those highly trained strategists, policy writers, and bureaucrats don't just, retire to the countryside.
They transition into think tanks.
Right.
But think tanks always sound so passive to me. Like a university library where people just sit around and write obscure essays.
That is a dangerous misconception. A highly engaged think tank operates more like a shadow government waiting in exile. They function as holding pens for intellectual capital. While they are out of power, they aren't just sitting around. They are actively refining their doctrines, building coalitions, writing op-eds to shape public discourse.
Getting ready for the next round.
Exactly. They are literally drafting policy papers so that the second they regain power, they have a fully formed operating system ready to install.
And the holding pen for the authors of the 1992 draft was an organization created in 1997 called the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC. The source notes PNAC was founded specifically to push a Reaganite U.S. foreign policy.
And if you read PNA's founding 1997 Statement of Principles, it reads like the spiritual and intellectual successor to the leaked 1992 draft. It is the exact same DNA, just unburdened by the constraints of actually being inside the Pentagon.
Let me pull the specific details the source provides on this 1997 statement. It openly calls for U.S. global leadership and preemptive action. It argues the U.S. cannot safely avoid the responsibilities of global leadership. And then there's this line which really stuck out to me. The history of the 20th century should have taught us that it is important to shape circumstances before crises emerge and to meet threats before they become dire.
Shape circumstances before crises emerge. We need to pause on that phrase. That is the ideological kernel that will eventually grow into the defining conflict of the 21st century.
Because it completely changes the definition of self-defense. It argues that waiting for an enemy to assemble a threat is unacceptable. You have to strike the enemy before they even have the capacity to threaten you.
Correct. It is the philosophical justification for preemptive war. And if you look at who signed that 1997 PNAC statement, it's not a group of fringe academics. It is the core architecture of the Republican foreign policy establishment.
Oh, the signatories are like a reunion tour of the 1992 drafting room. Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Louis Libby, Zalmay Khalilzad, the exact same people who wrote the blueprint 5 years earlier. And they are joined by new allies who will become very familiar to anyone who watched the news in the 2000s. Donald Rumsfeld, Peter Rodman, Elliott Abrams.
What you are witnessing is an incredible display of strategic patience. They are out of power, operating in the think tank wilderness, but they are diligently, methodically building an ironclad coalition around this specific unipolar vision.
Making sure everyone is on the exact same page.
Exactly. They're making sure that everyone in their camp is singing from the same sheet music.
And they don't just stop at a brief statement of principles either. Fast forward to September 2000. The Clinton administration is in its final months, getting ready to leave. PNAC publishes this massive book-length report titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century.
Quite a title.
Yeah, and the source attributes the principal authorship to Thomas Donnelly, with Donald Kagan and Gary Schmidt chairing the study group.
This document was a blatant, highly detailed transition plan. It was explicitly designed to serve as the foreign policy manual for the next president.
And they aren't hiding their influences at all. The introduction to the 2000 report literally cites the 1992 draft DPG as its guiding star.
They own it completely.
Right. The report states that the 1992 draft provided a blueprint for maintaining U.S. preeminence, precluding the rise of a great power rival, and shaping the international security order in line with American principles and interests, unquote. They actively defend the 1992 draft, arguing it was unfairly attacked by critics and wrongly buried by the Clinton administration. I mean, they took a disgraced leak and turned it into their central manifesto.
So by September 2000, this grand strategy has been written, leaked, defended, refined, and finally published as a comprehensive doctrine. It is a fully fueled engine sitting on a test block. All it needs is a vehicle.
And in early 2001, the vehicle arrives. George W. Bush wins the presidency, the wilderness years are over. The drafters don't just return to government, they take the steering wheel. Dick Cheney is vice president. Donald Rumsfeld is secretary of defense. Paul Wolfowitz is deputy secretary of defense. Louis Libby is Cheney's chief of staff.
The gang's all back together.
Exactly. The people who wrote the 1992 blueprint now control the Pentagon and the vice presidency.
But there is a crucial friction here that we have to acknowledge. Even with the authors of the DPG holding the highest levers of power, you cannot simply implement a strategy of unipolar dominance and preemptive war on a random Tuesday.
People wouldn't go for it.
No, the American public and the broader international community were not primed for a massive expansion of military intervention. Executing this doctrine requires immense political capital.
And then the theoretical abruptly becomes devastatingly real. September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks destroy the World Trade Center and strike the Pentagon. The American illusion of post-Cold War safety is completely shattered in a single morning.
It changes everything.
The nation goes into shock, and the Bush administration begins gearing up for the global war on terror and the eventual invasion of Iraq.
If we evaluate this strictly through the analytical lens of our source material, 9/11 functioned as a profound geopolitical catalyst. The 1992 draft DPG and the P&A strategy that evolved from it were essentially an incredibly aggressive solution waiting for a problem of sufficient magnitude.
And 9/11 was that problem.
Yes. The trauma, the fear, and the undeniable reality of the 9/11 attacks instantly generated the political environment required to enact the blueprint. Suddenly, the public and the legislature were deeply receptive to the argument that waiting for threats to materialize was suicide.
The atmosphere changed overnight, and people who'd been paying attention noticed the shift immediately, right? The source highlights a journalist named Jim Loeb, writing for the Interpress service in December 2001, so just 3 months after the attacks.
He saw it happening in real time.
He really did. He connected the dots. He wrote an article pointing out that the administration's new posture sounded identical to the leaked 1992 draft DPG. He reminded his readers about Joe Biden's Pax Americana, quote from a decade earlier, and he wrote, "The past, as is said, is prologue. The authors now are back in key positions, and their vision appears to be reviving."
Loeb recognized the architectural schematic overlaying the new, chaotic reality of the war on terror. The administration was deploying the exact rhetoric and strategic logic of the 1992 draft to frame the response to 9/11.
And this wasn't just media speculation. By 2002, it became official, codified United States policy. The Bush administration released its 2002 National Security Strategy, which the world quickly dubbed the Bush Doctrine. We have a summary of the Bush Doctrine in the source material from Robert Jervis, a prominent international relations scholar, and reading it is like experiencing pure déjà vu.
Walk us through Jervis's breakdown of the doctrine. Let's look at the specific components.
Okay, Jervis identifies 4 main pillars of the Bush Doctrine. First, a strong belief that a state's domestic regime determines its foreign policy. In practical terms, this meant the U.S. believed the only way to truly secure the international environment was to actually change the regimes of hostile states.
Which is a staggering departure from Cold War realism, where you just contained hostile regimes. This is a commitment to proactive transformation of foreign governments.
Exactly. Regime change is policy. The second pillar, the perception that great threats can only be defeated by preventive war.
Meet threats before they become dire. The exact language from the 1997 PNAC statement, now elevated to official national security policy.
The third pillar is a willingness to act unilaterally when necessary. If the UN or our allies don't agree with our assessment of a threat, we will forsake multilateralism and strike anyway.
Again, directly echoing the 1992 draft's mandate to bypass international coalitions if they impede U.S. interests.
And the final pillar, the core of the whole thing, an overriding sense that peace and stability require the United States to assert its absolute primacy in world politics.
It's all right there.
Jervis's summary of the 2002 Bush Doctrine is practically a photocopy of the 1992 draft DPG.
It is the ultimate vindication of the drafter's strategic patience. The document survived the public humiliation of the leak. It survived 8 years in the think tank wilderness, and in the crucible of 9/11, it was forged into the operating system of a superpower at war. The ideas they debated in a closed room in 1992 were now dictating the movement of armies across the Middle East.
But here's where things get strange again. Given that this doctrine was now public policy, given that the United States was openly fighting wars based on these exact premises in Iraq and Afghanistan, you would assume that the original 1992 document would just be treated as open historical record by the late 2000s, right?
You'd think so.
It should be a museum exhibit. But the story takes a sudden left turn into a bizarre battle over government secrecy.
The 2008 declassification battle. It is a fascinating case study in institutional memory, bureaucracy, and the lengths to which a government will go to protect its internal processes.
The setup is almost comical. It is February 2008. The Bush administration is entering its final months. The National Security Archive, a research group at George Washington University, successfully uses the Freedom of Information Act to compel the release of several documents related to the origins of this strategy.
Using FOIA to dig up the past.
Yeah. And among them is the original 1992 draft DPG. The Defense Department eventually hands it over, but large swaths of the text are blacked out, redacted.
Now, redacting classified information is standard protocol, usually to protect sources, methods, or ongoing operations. But that wasn't what was happening here.
Not even close. The source points out the profound absurdity of these redactions. The specific sentences and paragraphs the Pentagon was trying to keep secret in 2008 had already been printed verbatim on the front page of the New York Times in March of 1992. The entire world had already read them.
It's just absurd.
Not only that, the Pentagon was censoring phrases that they had officially published in their own public documents back in 1993.
Why go through the mechanical effort of censoring information that is already in the public domain? It raises a serious question about the motivation behind classification.
Tom Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, called them out on this perfectly. The source quotes him saying, "On close inspection, none of those deleted passages actually meet the standards for classification because embarrassment is not a legal basis for secrecy."
Embarrassment. That is the key word. They weren't protecting nuclear launch codes or covert operatives. They were trying to protect themselves from the historical record of their own internal arguments.
But I want to push you on that. Why would bureaucrats in 2008 care if a memo from 1992 was embarrassing? The policy was already a reality. We were living it. Why try to use a black Sharpie on a billboard that everyone has already seen?
Because the declassified documents, even with the redactions, revealed the immense internal friction of the policymaking process. The FOIA release showed the intense, frantic back-and-forth communication between Libby, Cheney, and Colin Powell, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the time.
So it showed them arguing.
Yes. It documented them actively trying to manipulate and recast the language of the doctrine so it would survive public scrutiny, while secretly ensuring it still fulfilled Cheney's mandate for absolute military supremacy.
So they're trying to hide the sausage making.
Precisely. Government institutions strive to present policy as the result of measured, inevitable consensus. The unredacted documents prove that the foundation of 21st century American foreign policy was actually a highly engineered, deeply controversial ideological project that had to be smuggled past the American public. The redactions were an attempt to erase the friction of that process from the official historical narrative.
Which brings us to the ultimate legacy of this document. We've traced its survival through the Bush administration. But the neoconservative movement faced an immense, bruising political backlash in the latter years of the Bush presidency, largely due to the human and economic costs of the protracted wars in the Middle East.
It became politically toxic.
Right, so a listener might reasonably assume that when neoconservatism fell out of favor, the 1992 blueprint died with it.
But the architecture of global power rarely shifts just because a specific political label becomes unpopular. The truly powerful ideas decouple from their authors. They mutate, and they embed themselves into the bipartisan foundation of the state.
And the Militarist Monitor source illustrates this endurance by jumping forward to the presidency of Donald Trump. Now, this is a fascinating contradiction. Donald Trump actively campaigned against the legacy of the Bush era. He railed against the endless wars in the Middle East. He frequently insulted the neoconservative establishment and criticized the idea of American nation building.
He positioned himself as the anti-neocon.
Exactly. Yet, according to a 2019 article from the New Republic that our source cites, Trump's actual baseline approach to U.S. security deeply echoed the core mechanical thesis of the 1992 DPG.
The rhetoric was completely different, but the underlying structural demand was identical. The source provides a direct quote from Donald Trump that perfectly encapsulates this. He stated, "Our military dominance must be unquestioned, and I mean unquestioned."
Unquestioned military dominance. If you strip away the date and the speaker, that sentence could easily have been lifted directly from Louis Libby's 1992 drafting room.
It is the exact same premise. The New Republic article offers a brilliant analysis of how this mutation occurred. It argues that Trump effectively adopted the unipolar supremacy aspect of the 1992 DPG, but he surgically removed its ethical pretense and strategic justification.
Let's break down that phrase, ethical pretense. What were the neoconservatives pretending to be ethical about?
Well, in the 1990s and 2000s, figures like Wolfowitz and the PNAC coalition wrapped their demand for military dominance in a very specific moral framework. They argued that American unipolarity was a necessary burden to spread democracy, to protect global human rights, and to build a peaceful, liberal international order.
Basically saying, we have to rule the world to save it.
Right. That was the ethical pretense, the world-building aspect of their strategy. The New Republic analysis suggests that the Trump era simply discarded that world-building mission. They weren't interested in spreading democracy or managing the internal politics of other nations.
But they kept the military part.
Enthusiastically, they retained the core mechanical requirement of the DPG that U.S. military power must remain vast, supreme, and completely unchallenged by any rival.
It's the realization that you don't need to subscribe to neoconservative philosophy to utilize the neoconservative machinery. The doctrine outgrew its creators. An administration that campaigned against the wars of the 2000s was still firmly resting on the exact same military baseline established by the architects of those wars.
It's baked into the system now.
It really proves that the 1992 draft DPG isn't just a piece of partisan history. It became the invisible, unquestioned operating system for American foreign policy, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office.
And that is the ultimate achievement for any strategic blueprint. True victory isn't when your policy is constantly debated and defended. True victory is when your policy becomes the accepted reality. It becomes the air the establishment breathes, to the point where they don't even realize they are operating within the parameters you drew 30 years ago.
Let's take a step back and look at the sheer scale of the journey we've just mapped. We started in 1991 with a frantic Pentagon trying to justify its existence after the Soviet collapse. We watched a small group of strategists write a radical, classified draft for global dominance in 1992.
We saw it leak, cause a massive scandal, and get publicly thrown out.
Right. Then we followed its survival into the think tank holding pens of the late 90s, where it was refined into a manifesto. We watched it rise from the ashes of 9/11 to become a sweeping, preemptive global doctrine that fundamentally altered the map of the Middle East. And finally, we saw its core logic endure into the modern era, stripped of its original rhetoric, but surviving as the absolute, unquestioned baseline of American power.
It is a profound, almost unsettling reminder of the latent power of the written word. A single document, drafted in a bureaucracy, can carry enough ideological weight to completely reshape the trajectory of the world.
It really makes you reconsider everything you see on the news. When you read about a diplomatic standoff, a carrier group moving into a contested strait, or a debate over defense spending, you have to ask yourself, how much of this is a spontaneous reaction to today's events, and how much of it is just the execution of a white paper written in a windowless room decades ago?
And if we follow the logic of the story to its natural conclusion, it leaves us with a deeply provocative thought.
Oh, I'm ready.
If a leaked, widely mocked, publicly disowned draft document from 1992 quietly survived to become the foundational operating system for the next 30 years of global politics, it makes you wonder, what obscure, highly classified draft document is being passed around a desk in the Pentagon right now, and what kind of world is it quietly designing for the year 2055?
A blueprint for a reality we haven't even begun to imagine yet. That is a heavy, fascinating thought to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the archives. We hope it gave you a new lens to view the scaffolding behind the headlines. Keep questioning, keep digging, and we will catch you next time.
If you enjoyed this, smash the like button and hit subscribe so you never miss an upload. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next video.